Assalamu alaikum. Starting with the great name of Allah, who is the most merciful and most beneficent. I am Emaan Fatima from BS English second semester, and my roll number is 24. The topic of my presentation is first edition of 20th century English poetry. Basically, there were two traditions of English poetry, 20th century English poetry. The first tradition was called the traditional tradition, and it was set up by the great poet Thomas Hardy. And the second tradition was called the modernist tradition, and it was set up by T.S. Eliot. As this tradition was set up by Thomas Hardy, we will discuss Thomas Hardy later. Now I am going to discuss the main points of this tradition. In 20th century, the poetry was flourished, but it was not possible for the poets to just live by the pen. It means that the poetry was flourished, bloomed, but it was not possible for the poets to just write and earn money or earn their living. They had to work for their living. They had to do something else to earn money. Like the great poet T.S. Eliot worked as a bank clerk while he was writing the masterpiece of his writing, The Waste Land. And the Philip Larkin, another great poet of 20th century, worked as a university librarian while he was also writing poetry. Now, the economic situation was depressed, but a vast amount of poetry was produced. In 20th century, the economic situation was disturbed. It was not that much good, but a vast amount of poetry was produced. It means that a large number of poetry was produced in 20th century. Now, as this tradition is associated with Thomas Hardy, we will discuss Thomas Hardy now. As the novel writing of Hardy was ended in 1890s, after that he devoted himself for poetry. As a novel writer, he left novel writing in 1890s, but now he fully devoted himself for poetry in 20th century. English poets had great respect for Hardy. He was cremated and interred in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. When Hardy died, his body and his heart got separated, and his heart was placed separately, and his body was burned into ashes, and then buried in the Corner of Westminster Abbey. It was a place where great number of famous poets were buried. His poetry can be summarized by a motto: keep it simple. It means that the main theme of his poetry was simplicity. Poetry is wholly summarized in a motto that is keep it simple. His technique can be traced back to the lyrical ballads of Coleridge and Wordsworth. It means that the techniques used in the lyrical ballads of S.T. Coleridge and William Wordsworth are also used in the writing of Hardy. The next point is the modernists opted for the free verse, but Hardy retained old disciplines of rhyme and meter. The modern poets used to use free verse in their writing, but Hardy retained old disciplines of rhyme and meter. In Urdu, we called it Kafiya and Radif. Like Wordsworth, Hardy was influenced by folk songs. Hardy also liked music and hail songs. uh, Hardy like Hardy was all influenced by Wordsworth. Means Wordsworth like folk songs. Hardy also like folk songs, but Hardy also like music and hail songs. Hardy's favorite poets were Sir Walter Scott and Homer. He even attempted a Homeric epic, The Dynast, focused on the heroic figure of Napoleon. The Napoleon was a great military officer of that time, and he was a person who conquered most part of the Europe. Hardy had big ideas, but he was at the best when he put them into tiny containers. It means that A small line of Hardy writing, there is a big idea. Means when he write something, he put a big idea into a tiny container. Here is another point that prominent on Hardy's bookshelf was Darwin Origin of Species, which he read as a tragic contradiction of religion. This point also is also related to the previous point which I discussed before, that Hardy had big ideas in his writing. Lyrical simplicity and kind of stoical pessimism are active ingredients in Hardy's verse. It means that Hardy's verse had a great simplicity, and stoical pessimism is also the ingredient of his writing. One of the Hardy's most characteristic poem is Convergence of the Twain. The title points to Hardy with the combination of polysyllabic word convergence and the dialect word that is twain. On April 15, 1912, the Titanic, the pride of Britain's merchant marine, struck an iceberg and sank with significant loss of life. Hardy saw this even tragic and emblematic loss of human pride. The Titanic was a very big ship, and it was called the Pride of Human at that time. So it got stuck and sank in sea, and it was a tragic and emblematic fall of human pride in sight of Hardy. Hardy suggests that Titanic converging with the iceberg was not a coincidence, but rather an event planned by an imminent will. So, as at that time, it was said that this was the pride of human and it sank. So, as Hardy said that the event happened is event planned by the eminent will. It was not a coincidence. The poem Imminent Will lingers on the image of the fatal iceberg. The British shipyard pride and its fall are simultaneously convinced by fate. Uh, Hardy said that all that happened was pre-planned by the nature. Humans are not humans are small in front of nature. We cannot. It means we cannot challenge nature. Next point is Hardy uses the difficult verses of from triplets, three line stanzas of variable length with the same rhyme word. So in Hardy's writing, uh, the length of stanzas are variable, but with the same rhyme word, and at the same rhyme word. Hardy's example created a norm, namely the principal verse form in English poetry was the short lyric, complete on a single printed page and often ironic in tone. It means that Hardy's example created a norm that is principal verse form in English poetry, and it was written on a single printed page, and the tone is ironic. The influence can be traced in the work of one of the other giants of 20th century English poetry, that is W.H. Auden. Uh, W.H. Auden was another great poet of 20th century who was also influenced by Hardy. So W.H. Auden, his time period is from 1907 to 1973. In his late 30s, Auden became an American citizen, but the earlier English Auden was a confessed disciple of Hardy. In the last 30 years of Hardy's life, he became an American citizen. But when he was living in Britain, he was confessed disciple of Hardy. Auden was most recently been renowned for his elegy funeral blues, and he also thanked to the popular British film for a wedding and a funeral. So a funeral blue was the famous poem of W.H. Auden. It was an elegy. Elegy is the kind of poetry which was written on someone's death, and he also thanks for wedding and a funeral, which was the popular British film. So, in the first stanza, note the architecture of odd and verse and the recall Hardy's obsession with form. In the first stanza of the poem Funeral Blue, we have to note the architecture of odd and verse and the recall Hardy's obsession with form. The insistent rhyme and symmetry seems to control the energy of the verse and the novelty of Auden's vision. Means the rhyme and symmetry has the energy of the overall poetry of yeah, or we can say the overall poem. And the novelty of Auden's vision, it means that there is something new in the vision of Auden. Let me read first stanza of Funeral Blues. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. Despite the surreal juxtaposition, phones, juicy bones, drums, and coffins, readers are drawn into poem by its transparent simplicity. It means when we read this poem, we come to know about its simplicity and its transparency by reading this. So we can also see Hardy's pessimism in Auden's verse. It means that Auden's verse is also pessimistic approach of Hardy. Their lonely batters pictures the poet sitting on the chair in an English garden. The it is summer and Robin is singing, but not in language, in pure sound. In the poem, Their Lonely Batter, the poet is sitting on the chair and it is the summer season and a robin is singing, and not in a language but in pure sound. Means it is singing not in language. The poem goes on to ask whether language brings us together or isolates us. Here a question arises that whether in this poem that whether the language brings us together or isolates us. Language, then the poet also answers the question. The language enables us to articulate, define, and differentiate ourselves from others. Language differentiates us from other species. That language is the main thing that differentiates us from others. Now, Auden was strongly influenced by Farad's essay Civilization and Its Contents, in which the great psychoanalyst argued that the more civilized we become, the unhappier we become. Auden was also influenced by Farad. Farad was a great essayist. He wrote Civilization and Its Discontents, in which the psychoanalyst said that the more civilized we become, the more unhappier we become. Auden's lyric ends on a pessimistic note. The birds with only song, not language, are not just happier but more blessed by God. It means that Auden's writing is also pessimistic. The birds with only song, not language. He says that those who don't have any language are more blessed by the God and they are more happier. The Hardy's line in 20th century English poetry also extend to the greatest of his disciples, that is Philip Larkin. And the time period of Philip Larkin is 1922 to 1985. It means that the 20th century English poetry of Hardy is also extend to Philip Larkin. And this is the last point of my presentation. Thank you so much for your listening and watching.